Welcome to Weekday, Wednesday of Holy Week. Yesterday on Tricks Day, Tuesday, we saw how the Lord Jesus was asked 4 tricky questions, all of which he answered, then asked one of his own which they couldn't answer. And he went on then to berate the religious leaders for their posturing, their hypocritical attitude towards their religion. He said, "Beware of the scribes, who like to go about in long robes and to have salutations in the marketplaces and the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honour at feasts, who devour widows' houses and for a pretence make long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." And he sat down opposite the treasury and watched the multitude putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums, and a poor widow came and put in 2 copper coins. And he called his disciples to him and said to them, "Truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For they all contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in everything she had, her whole living." Religious duty to widows was very much part of the Jewish religion. Back in Exodus 22, we hear the Lord saying, "You shall not afflict any widow or orphan. If you do afflict them, and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry." So the Lord Jesus has moved from criticizing the Pharisees, and he's now sitting down, which is usually a prelude to him teaching, between the court of the Gentiles and the court of the women. And there we find the beautiful gate. Now, there are 8 gates for the temple. This particular one is probably the gate Nicanor, sometimes called the Corinthian gate. It's 75 feet high, that's 25 meters, if you prefer that kind of measurement. The 2 doors are made of bronze. It's the main entry into the court of the women. Around the side, there are 2 colonnades or porticos, if you prefer to call them that. The portico of Solomon and the royal portico. And as we said, Jesus has sat down. Looks like he's about to teach, and he's sitting opposite 13 trumpets. Now, these trumpets are offertory boxes, if you like. They are narrow at the top and wide at the bottom, and they all have a specific role. So if you're putting your money in the first 2, which is by the gate of Susan, you're putting your half a shekel in for your annual temple tax. If you're paying money into boxes, trumpets 3 and 4, that's instead of offering turtle doves or pigeons as a sacrifice. Trumpet 5 is for the wood burnt on the altar. Trumpet 6 is for incense. 7 is for the golden vessels. And 8 to 12 are for any spare change you've got left over after you paid for your sacrifices. If you put it in trumpet 13, that's the voluntary offering. There's also at the treasury, otherwise known as the chamber of the silent, where all the money goes to, and you can go directly to there, put your money in secretly, and that money will be used for the education of poor children. As we've said, almsgiving, duty to the poor, very much part of the Jewish religion. We read, don't we, in Matthew chapter 6, that the Lord Jesus is giving instructions on almsgiving, on prayer and on fasting. And he says, when you do these things, not if you do them, but when you do them, he expects us to pray and to fast and to give to the poor. And he says, don't announce it with trumpets, which is a little bit of humour that we'd miss if we're not Jewish, really. Back in the 12th century, a great Jewish philosopher and physician, the greatest scholar of his age, Maimonides, laid down 8 levels of giving charity. Now, charity, the Hebrew word for charity is tzedakah. Those of us old enough to remember Neil Sedaka, the great singer-songwriter, well, his name meant charity. These are the 8 levels. If you're giving at level 8, you are pained to give it. You give it really grudgingly. Level 7, the donor gives less than he should, but he at least gives cheerfully. 6, the donor gives after being asked. 5, the donor gives without being asked. Level 4, the recipient knows the donor, but the donor does not know the recipient. Level 3 is a reverse of that principle. And at level 2, neither person knows who has given or where the money's going to. But if you reach level 1, that level is where you are giving in such a way as to make the recipient self-sufficient. You're helping him set up in business. So a number of organisations have suggested that instead of buying a Christmas present for someone, you might buy a goat for someone on the other side of the world, and then that helps make them self-sufficient because they begin to have their own business, create their own milk and wool and that kind of thing. That's level one, if you like. So Jesus is sitting down watching, and many of the rich give ostentatiously. I think we've often been aware of some people who like to wave their money around and say, look how much money I'm giving. We see that, unfortunately, in the likes of Red Nose Day, Children in Need, marvellous things such as they are, or the National Lottery. Though they do set up many causes, at the same time there's people shouting, we've given all this money, and I don't like that. It doesn't sit well with me. The biblical principle is to give in such a way that your left hand doesn't know what your right hand is doing secretly. And I always think that that's really why I struggle to play the piano. The left hand does not know what the right hand is doing. Now, Jesus watches the rich giving ostentatiously, as we've said. A poor widow comes along with 2 small coins. We call this the widow's mite. She gives 2 lepta, and lepta was worth 1/40, or 2.5% of the daily wage, and daily wage was a penny in those days, an old penny. Giving to the trumpets, the minimum statutory amount was 2 lepta. If you wanted to give 1 lepton, you would have to speak to the authorities, and they'd know how little you were putting in. And this coin is the smallest coin of all Jewish coins, and it's the only one that gets mentioned in the New Testament. So effectively, she is giving half a tithe, 5% of a daily wage if she is even working. A bit like me, say, giving £3 in the collection, something like that. And Luke says that she is a poor widow, and he uses a word, penikra, and that speaks about poverty. It means you've got very little, but enough to get by on. If he'd have used the word patokos, that would have spoken of penury, the state of being a beggar, of having absolutely nothing at all. So this is a woman who has enough to get by on. But what she does is put all that she has to get by on for the day into the offering. And Jesus says they all contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, her whole living. Now, how did he know? How did he know that she'd given everything that she had? Well, he's Jesus, isn't he? John 2 tells us he didn't need anyone to tell him what was going on inside of other people's heads or hearts, because he knew man, he knew women, he knew what they were like. He's the Son of God. You can talk about different kinds of giving here, can't you? The sacrificial giving, where you give and it costs you, but at the same time you've got something left. Remember the discussion between the pig and the chicken, and they're discussing the wonderful English breakfast and how they both contribute to it. And the pig says to the chicken, you've probably heard this before, the pig says to the chicken, well, for you, it's a donation giving an egg, but for me, it's a sacrifice. And so there is sacrificial giving where you give and it really costs you. And this woman gives recklessly. She could have given 1 coin and kept back enough, something to live on for the day, but she didn't. And the challenge really comes to us. What do we hold back from God so that even after we have given, we have something to live on? Do I live like that? Temptation to say, yes, I'll give this to God and I'll give that to God, but I like to reserve this portion of my life, which is mine, and you can't be part of that, God, because I need my time out. But that's not how the woman gave, nor how the Bible expects us to live. And remember, this is not so much about money. After all, no one has the right to judge me on how much I put into the collection or don't put in. You don't know what I'm giving or not giving, and I have no right to judge you. Only the Lord really knows what you're giving in terms of your money, your time, your abilities. There was a group of people in the early days of the church known as parabolani. In a sense, they were the first nurses, but they were also a reckless group who would attend the sick and the dead, knowing that in doing so, they could die. They gave their lives recklessly to help others. And that's what we're seeing in society at this time, aren't we? People giving recklessly of themselves to serve the needs of the poor, the housebound, the vulnerable. And that is the kind of giving that God really approves of. May the Lord bless you and keep you, and make his face shine upon you, and give you peace.